Securing Critical Infrastructure, the Regulatory versus the Practical, a special InnovationOz.com podcast series brought to you by SentinelOne. The emergence of the critical infrastructure legislation is driving protection to the top of the agenda for many Australian businesses as they grapple to improve their cybersecurity posture. Compounding this challenge is the disconnect between the hype around cyber threats and a practical understanding of what to do at the organisational level. In this podcast series, we speak to independent experts who will step away from the technical and focus on the practicalities of the new legislation.
Welcome to the changing face of critical infrastructure in Australia, part of Securing Critical Infrastructure, the Regulatory versus the Practical podcast series. Today with me, I have Dr. Huon Curtis, who's a Senior Research Fellow, Tech Policy Design Centre at the Australian National University, and Jason Duerden, SentinelOne's Regional Director for Australia and New Zealand. Welcome to both of you.
Great to be here.
Thanks, Corrie.
Now, I might start with you, Huon. You have worked in strategic policy for a number of years across various organisations, right at a time where critical infrastructure has really been pulled into focus from a national security perspective as well as, a cybersecurity challenge for organisations. At the Tech Policy Design Centre, can you give me a little bit of background on your role and maybe the centre itself and its function?
Sure, thanks for having me. Well, I think the first thing to say is that there's a lot of cliches thrown around in the world of national security. And, some of these are like the world is more complex and uncertain. The nature of the threat environment has changed. We're facing climate, cyber threats, technological change, geopolitical and personal threats. And these all impact our critical systems. And why a strategic unit like the Tech Policy Design Centre exists is to grapple with that uncertainty, to uncover some of those cliches and to help with that conceptualisation. But the goal in this isn't just to say the world is complex. We know that. And what we need to do is to seek precision in the language that we use about these problems, because the words that we use actually have regulatory effects. And also they have effects on how it is that the citizenry conduct their lives. So one project that I'm working on at the moment is about risk and resilience in the telecommunications sector, so one of the critical infrastructure sectors. And this question of how we improve resilience is the question I'm grappling with. The concept of resilience is thrown around a lot, often in a way that doesn't necessarily have a clear meaning. It might be used in some context to shift responsibility away from government, or away from industry, because it gives, if it's not seen as a personal responsibility, it's your fault that you built your house in the flood zone. We gave you the best information, but nonetheless you proceeded, and so the problem is it can be used to shift the burden elsewhere. But we've seen it used much more in this national security context, particularly in the last 15 years. In this context, there's been a tendency to have these broad aims. National resilience, to build a resilient country. But unpacking precisely what that means is, I think, the task that I'm actually involved with at the moment. It's clear to me that what we include in that picture, and then what we're in fact trying to measure, and the goals that we're trying to reach are often unclear across the sector. People use it in different ways. And I think the other thing is that the threat picture, the kinds of challenges that we're facing are also shifting. So in the telecommunications space, we're not just thinking about Optus and Telstra. Now we're thinking about a whole lot of infrastructure needs that go into the nature of technology of the sector. So the problem space is changing. How operators are connected in it looks very different. Now the kind of consumer demands that we're facing have shifted, and there's also the rising influence of the internet and how the internet is changing the space of telecommunication. Because we're seeing the more kind of internetization of telecommunication. And behind all this, and as Jason will talk about, I'm sure, we've got these communication systems that sit behind our pharmaceutical systems, our manufacturing systems, and they're all tied together by subsea cables, by data storage capabilities. So that's where I think the cyber dimension comes in. But when we think about infrastructure, it's not just the physical assets anymore. It's also about the computer systems, the data systems, where they are located. And so suddenly we've got this very big problem space where initially we might have just thought, oh, we'll just pick up a phone call and it's a phone, and then it's from a copper wire to through an exchange to another household. But actually, the system is greatly changed now.
There's a few things you said there that I want to bring you in on, Jason. One is like language and interpretation, and I think that's something you'll probably see when you're talking both government and private sector around interpretation of the critical infrastructure legislation. And you alluded to the complexity and the matrices and the interdependency of lots of different players. How are people you're talking to understanding, one, how legislation relates to them and how they're approaching, rising to the challenge of making sure their organisations are protected when it comes to critical infrastructure?
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes down to the type of organisation and the maturity curve that they're on. So, if you think about critical infrastructure, historically has meant power, water, telecommunications. The Critical Infrastructure Act and legislation now covers things like food supply and other types of industries which weren't necessarily a traditional critical infrastructure type of organisation. So I think if you went to a more traditional style organisation such as a power company, a water company, oil and gas, so on and so forth, the maturity level is much greater there, right? Because they've been adhering to a lot of these policies and requirements for some time, versus in maybe a newer classed type of organisation, really not necessarily starting their security journey, but starting their security journey in the context of being critical infrastructure, because there are a lot more stringent requirements for that. So I think the interpretation still is very industry dependent. So it's difficult to have the same requirements in a power company versus a supermarket, for example, or a food delivery or food supply or a healthcare organisation. However, the principles of managing the security program are somewhat the same, right? There's just technical elements which are different. So I think initially there was some interpretation challenges of, do we need to adhere to the same levels of a power company or a telco? And I think that is now subsided. I think it's become more understood as these new industries are coming into that act. And I think what we try and do as a provider of tools and services and things that we do with our clients is really try and align our customer needs to standardized frameworks like the NIST cybersecurity framework, which adheres to a lot of the legislative requirements of the Critical Infrastructure Act. So I guess the summary there is not everybody is going to have the same requirements. However, there are multiple ways to achieve the same outcome, and that's what we try and do with our customers. Yeah.
You just mentioned NIST, which is I guess an international standard on many levels. I know a lot of the work the Tech Policy Design Centre is engaging with understanding regulatory environments in different regions. The Quad's obviously top of mind, in recent weeks. The Ukraine obviously brought the idea of telco and access to communications and critical infrastructure into sharp focus. How do you see, from a global perspective, other countries that really are in a different place, and what could Australia potentially learn from some of these real and recent examples?
It's a good question. I think the first thing is, when we're thinking about the threat picture, we're not just talking about threat, we're also talking about opportunities. So when we're thinking about the infrastructure systems, and how to safeguard them. We're not just trying to nail things down and close gates and close doors. We're thinking about how we can use technology to develop opportunity and economic opportunity that might come behind that. So, what I think we've learned in recent years is that vulnerabilities are in all systems. That is reality. It's not something that we should be scared of. But if we get into the mindset where all we're doing is cataloging vulnerabilities and sources of potential damage, then we can actually then fall into a kind of false sense of security and fail to seek innovative opportunities. When we think about these systems, if we don't have an account of if we're exposing ourselves to too little stress, and we're not seeking to learn from things and to create new opportunities, then we're not actually fully embracing the opportunities of the current day. So not just about safeguarding, it's also about making sure that we are taking risk. I think that's the two sides of risk. It's not just about locking things down. It is also about getting ourselves into a mindset where we're putting ourselves out there and taking risks. I think about international examples like the DARPA model, where that has driven research and development in the United States for many years. They have a criteria where it is reportedly, if they're not having an 80% failure rate, then they're not hitting their targets. That kind of mindset is something that needs to be, encouraged and adopted in aspects of the Australian innovation ecosystem, because I think that is the way to drive change. One thing I think that we need to get a little bit more over our own timidity about our own innovation successes, because I think there have been some successes particularly at the state level. I think about initiatives that have been driven out of Service New South Wales that have used citizen data to try and create digital solutions, and there are certain examples of that now being that were kind of incubated within the state. Within New South Wales, and are now being trialled at the national level. There are success stories like that I think we can point to and try and encourage more of. Certainly, I think with the new government, there's been more of a focus on the multiple sides of creating opportunity, that we're not just thinking about cyber threats in particular. Certainly, from the cyber minister, from the Minister for Home Affairs, Claire O'Neill, there's been a clear indication that we are behind in some aspects. There's no denying that. I think setting a goal of being the most cyber secure country by 2030 is a clear indication that there's more to be done. My colleagues recently here at the Tech Policy Design Centre just wrote a piece on ransomware, where one of the recommendations was that there's a board level statement of compliance, or statement of what is actually being done at the board level, because it's clear that at the director level there's still complacency about the cyber environment. That said, it's a difficult thread to what's the cliche? Difficult needle to thread for the government to try and get the boardrooms of Australia on board for that thing. But then, not only that, I think across not just the director level, then there's all these other initiatives that I think are starting to come together. We've seen in the recent budget statement, there's activities around quantum and AI that are trying to inculcate more innovation across the board, as well as the Reconstruction Fund, the National Reconstruction Fund, which is meant to be driving investments into critical technologies. And some of this stuff, I think, there's a tendency in Australia when we think about that we resort to some excuses. Like I think about the university system in particular, where we've got a world-leading research sector in terms of our metrics internationally, and in terms of the kinds of publications, the quality of publications that come out. But we actually need to think beyond just the discovery value of publications, we need to think about some of the commercialization aspects and how it is that we draw in commerce and industry more broadly into the research sector. That's also, another rationale for why it is that my centre, the Tech Policy Design Centre, exists, is to be a conduit between government and industry to do research in a different way, to bring in different partners to try and drive regulatory and industry outcomes to drive that overall industry innovation agenda in the country. So, in short, I think dealing with the comparisons with other countries, of course, there's lessons we can learn, but on the flip side, there's enormous sources of innovation in this country, and I think what we can learn from some of the, it often doesn't take more than a team of 10 people to drive innovation in different ways. So, just because we're a small country, we should be thinking big. I think there's some excitement about aspects of the new government's agenda, but there's definitely, I think, still a way to go in different areas.
100%. Huon, we're talking a lot about the Quad at the moment. Is that with a specific focus? What are you seeing from a cyber critical infrastructure perspective when we're talking about the Quad?
I think the newest thing, certainly the pandemic has driven a lot of collaboration between the Quad countries. There's no doubt about that. I think firstly, we saw the vaccine diplomacy and collaboration on vaccines. There's been, the technological aspect of biotechnology and AI that have kind of driven that vaccine revolution, that has then meant that we've been able to return in some respects to a more normal existence. But I think what we'll see and what is new in this current statement is the software resilience statement. There's the Quad partners have developed these joint principles to collectively improve software, and I noticed even today that there's an indication from Home Affairs, I think in upcoming Senate estimates, that aspects of the software supply chain will be explored more fully. So I think that's something new that will influence how it is, because open source software systems drive innovation across all of our systems, but they're also integral to things like software defined networks, including in our satellite system. So how it is that code is being developed is going to become, it's clear that it's going to become more of a more within view of government in the next 6 to 12 months. And I'm sure Jason has some things to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely at the forefront being a provider, A, of software, but then B, working to protect organizations who consume hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of pieces of software in their environment. I mean, a recent example was the 3CX hack, which was a pretty widespread supply chain vulnerability hack. Didn't necessarily result in harm or organizations being put in a negative position because it was caught so early on. There's plenty of information that we were able to come out with at SentinelOne about that. And I think that's where the benefit of AI and generative AI and machine learning coming into cybersecurity has really been able to help us find these things as early as we possibly can. You're never going to have 100% prevention and stopping of attacks. However, we can get very close. The ability to then detect quickly, respond, and recover and remediate is something that we're focused on as part of our supply chain risk management with our customers, and that's where AI, machine learning, generative AI, language models, helping customers understand what they should be looking for based on that AI backbone has really shown huge benefits in achieving that.
100%. There's a few things I wanted to pick up on and direct to you, Jason. One of the things like around risk and appetite and change and a dynamic approach to challenges. There seems to be the cybersecurity industry seems to be in some ways very dynamic and lots of interesting things happening. We have a big, there's a large cohort of very, innovative Australian cyber companies, but then we also find people default to the same kind of fear, uncertainty, doubt, kind of old school approaches. So how do we kind of close the gap where we can get, some of the basic protections, reframed in the minds of businesses particularly, but also government?
Yeah, I mean, I think in looping back to Huon's point and the work that the Tech Design Centre is doing, the board statement is a good example of things that we can help to raise. Not just, I think the awareness level is there across the country. I mean, globally, that cybersecurity is a key priority. However, the where it stacks in the priority list, I think, is the question that's still to be answered. And I think having more ownership and responsibility at that board level will remove, I guess, the perception that FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, is required to take action, right? And I think that's kind of what happens in the cybersecurity sphere today is because a lot of it is not visible unless you have a physical impact, ransomware incident where the devices are encrypted, the data is being leaked on the dark web, and the company is in this fight or flight scenario. It's one of those things that you don't know it's a problem until it's in your face, kind of thing. So a lot of people who are not technology literate or aren't in the cybersphere day to day potentially don't appreciate the potential risk until an event happens, right? And I think the fear mongering has been a way to try and incite a level of engagement to then educate. Now, I don't necessarily believe that's the right way to go about running a security program and educating people, but I think perhaps for a period of time it was necessary whilst the education level around cybersecurity was lifting, right? And I think now that we're at, I would think that we're at a pretty common understanding that cybersecurity is a problem and cybersecurity is something we need to focus on. Now that we're at that level, I don't think fear, uncertainty, and doubt is the right way to educate people, right? I think people understand that this needs to be a priority. So now it's about what are we going to do, right? What things are we going to implement? What technologies, what processes, what people, what legislation, what policies are we going to implement to continue to raise? And I would echo Huon's statements that I think the current government is doing a great job at putting that out into the public sphere and making it known that this is a priority for them, which is naturally having a trickling effect down into the public and private sector. So I think we're in a different sphere now. I think maybe the fear mongering was possibly needed at a certain point in time to enact change and get people interested. It's like any movement. There needs to be a bit of noise, and there needs to be someone making, kind of kicking the dirt up for people to pay attention. We've moved past that now. We're in the opportune moment now where people understand. Let's actually help them, make changes and put things in place to achieve the goals that they're trying to do.
And I think on that point, Jason, companies are starting to see, and consumer behavior is definitely driving that change, because if you think about the Optus hack or the Latitude financial hack, the lack of resilience of an organization then means that that drives consumer exit from that company. So securing or making these systems more resilient actually is a sign of commercial maturity. It's a commercial differentiator, and then that leads to profitability. So I think that those connections, after some very high-profile activities, are starting to cut through, and certainly on the kind of emergency management side of things, we've seen data breaches in Victoria where emergency management providers have had to resort to legacy radio equipment in order to communicate effectively. So to respond to fires and floods. So, all of these systems, if they're not operating in a in a secure or resilient manner, then it actually will impact the kinds of responses that government can make in instance of national security. And not to draw it too much back into that Ukraine example, but when we're thinking about when there's a possibility of some geopolitical events that may drive the unanticipated, and then how that hinges upon our national infrastructure, then that is a concern. And if at the board level there's not a commitment to aspects of that, the shared goals that we should have as a nation, then companies aren't doing their bit, and they should be.
I think we have covered a lot of ground today, and I'm going to draw it to a close. I think coming back to your points, Jason, that kind of fear, uncertainty, doubt of kind of pushing towards action, teamed with some, high-profile, breaches that we've seen, and now kind of entering into a new dawn where we have the, very clear focus from, the Australian government looking at our, friends and allies from a cyber perspective, and a reframing of what critical infrastructure actually means to all of us. I think that it would be good to catch up in 6 months and see how some of that action has played out. But I'd like to thank both of you for joining me today. Dr. Huon Curtis, thank you so much, and Jason Duerden from SentinelOne. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for having us, Corrie.
Thanks, Corrie. Appreciate it.
We hope you enjoyed this Securing Critical Infrastructure, the Regulatory versus the Practical podcast, brought to you by SentinelOne. For more, keep tuning in to innovationoz.com/podcasts or visit sentinelone.com.